Number 10. Richard Farley and Laura Black. The Silicon Valley Nightmare. Richard Farley's obsessive pursuit of Laura Black stands as one of the most disturbing examples of workplace stalking that culminated in mass violence, a case that would forever change how corporations and law enforcement agencies approach threats made by obsessed individuals in professional environments. Laura Black was a brilliant electrical engineer working at ESL Incorporated, a defense contractor in Sunnyvale, California, during the mid-1980s, a time when the tech industry was booming and Silicon Valley was becoming the epicenter of American innovation. She was competent, professional, and well-respected among her colleagues, focusing on her career and maintaining appropriate boundaries with coworkers. Richard Farley, a software engineer at the same company, became fixated on Laura shortly after she started working there in 1984, interpreting her basic professional courtesy as romantic interest and constructing an elaborate fantasy relationship in his mind that bore no resemblance to reality. What began as seemingly harmless attempts at conversation quickly escalated into an all-consuming obsession that would dominate both their lives for years. Farley started leaving gifts on Laura's desk, writing lengthy letters professing his love, and finding excuses to appear wherever she was in the building, behavior that made Laura increasingly uncomfortable as she realized his interest went far beyond normal workplace friendliness. When Laura politely declined his advances and asked him to stop contacting her, Farley's behavior intensified rather than ceased, a pattern that would repeat itself throughout the escalating nightmare. He began following her home, discovering where she lived and driving past her apartment at all hours, sometimes parking outside for extended periods while watching her windows. Laura documented every incident meticulously, keeping detailed records of Farley's unwanted contact, letters, and appearances, creating a paper trail that she hoped would protect her if the situation worsened. She reported his behavior to ESL management multiple times, but the company's initial response was inadequate, treating the situation as a personal matter between employees rather than a serious security threat, a failure that would later be scrutinized in the aftermath of violence. As Laura's complaints continued and Farley's behavior showed no signs of stopping, ESL finally took action, firing Farley in 1986 after he refused to cease his harassment despite repeated warnings. The termination of his employment, rather than ending his obsession, removed the last structural constraint on Farley's behavior and freed him to dedicate even more time and energy to pursuing Laura. After being fired, Farley's stalking became his full-time occupation, and he began appearing at places Laura frequented, sending more letters and making it clear through his actions that losing his job had only intensified his fixation. Laura obtained a restraining order against Farley in 1987, a legal document that provided her with some official protection but did little to actually stop his persistent harassment. Farley violated the restraining order repeatedly, demonstrating the limitation of such orders when dealing with individuals who have become completely divorced from rational thinking and social norms. Laura lived in constant fear, altering her routines, changing her phone number multiple times, moving to different apartments, and taking various security precautions, but Farley always managed to find her again, displaying a level of dedication to his obsession that consumed his entire existence. The psychological toll on Laura was immense as she tried to maintain her career and personal life while constantly looking over her shoulder, never knowing when Farley might appear or what he might do next. Friends and family grew increasingly concerned as they watched Laura's quality of life deteriorate under the weight of relentless harassment. But law enforcement options remained limited in an era before comprehensive stalking laws existed in most jurisdictions. On February 16, 1988, Richard Farley's 4-year campaign of stalking reached its horrifying culmination when he arrived at ESL Incorporated armed with multiple firearms, hundreds of rounds of ammunition, and a clear intention to commit mass violence. Farley forced his way into the building and began shooting, targeting Laura specifically but killing anyone who got in his way or happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time during his rampage. He murdered 7 ESL employees during the massacre: Larry Kane, Buddy James, Helen Lamparter, Robert Carr, Patricia Swanson, David Lane, and Randy Stone, each victim an innocent person whose only connection to Farley's obsession was working at the same facility as Laura Black. Farley shot Laura as well, striking her in the shoulder, but she survived by hiding in a desk drawer during the siege that followed, remaining silent and still for hours while Farley roamed the building and eventually engaged in a standoff with police. The siege lasted for several hours as Farley held police at bay, eventually surrendering after negotiations and being taken into custody, facing multiple murder charges. The attack at ESL shocked Silicon Valley and the nation, representing one of the first major workplace mass shootings to receive extensive media coverage and forcing a national conversation about workplace violence, stalking, and corporate responsibility for employee safety. During the subsequent investigation, the full extent of Farley's obsession became clear as police found numerous weapons, ammunition stockpiles, and extensive documentation of his surveillance of Laura, including detailed logs of her movements and activities that demonstrated the depth of his fixation. Farley was charged with 7 counts of first-degree murder, attempted murder, and multiple weapons violations, facing a legal process that would examine not only his actions on February 16th, but the entire 4-year stalking campaign that preceded the violence. His trial in 1991 became a watershed moment in legal discussions about stalking, obsession, and the predictability of violence in such cases. Farley's defense team argued that his mental state should be considered, presenting evidence of his delusional thinking and obsessive patterns, but prosecutors successfully argued that his actions were premeditated and that his extensive planning demonstrated consciousness of wrongdoing. The jury found Richard Farley guilty on all counts, and he was sentenced to death, joining California's death row where he remains today, decades later, as his case winds through the extensive appeals process typical of capital punishment cases. Laura Black survived her physical wounds but faced a long psychological recovery from the trauma of years of stalking and the horror of the massacre that had been directed primarily at her. She became an advocate for stalking victims, using her experience to push for stronger laws and better corporate policies regarding workplace harassment and threats. The ESL massacre directly contributed to California passing the first anti-stalking law in the United States in 1990, legislation that created a specific criminal offense for the pattern of behavior Farley had exhibited, providing law enforcement with tools that hadn't existed during Laura's ordeal. Other states quickly followed California's lead, and within a few years, anti-stalking legislation existed throughout the country, representing a fundamental shift in how the legal system approached obsessive harassment. The case also transformed corporate approaches to workplace violence prevention, with many companies implementing threat assessment teams, better security protocols, and more serious responses to employee complaints about harassment or threatening behavior. Workplace violence experts cite the ESL massacre as a turning point that demonstrated the potential for workplace stalking to escalate to mass violence and the importance of taking early warning signs seriously. Laura Black's ordeal illustrates the psychological horror of being stalked by someone who refuses to accept rejection, the inadequacy of institutional responses before better laws and protocols existed, and the catastrophic consequences when obsession is allowed to fester unchecked for years. The 7 people who died at ESL were victims not just of Richard Farley's violence on one terrible day, but of a system that failed to adequately protect Laura Black and, by extension, everyone around her from a threat that escalated over 4 years with ample warning signs along the way. The case remains a stark reminder that stalking is not merely harassment but often a precursor to violence, that obsession unchecked can lead to catastrophic outcomes, and that societal and institutional responses to such behavior must be swift, comprehensive, and taken seriously before tragedy occurs, rather than being examined only in hindsight. Number 9. Robert John Bardo and Rebecca Schaeffer. When fandom turns fatal, the murder of Rebecca Schaeffer by obsessed fan Robert John Bardo on July 18, 1989, represents one of the most significant cases in American criminal history regarding celebrity stalking, ultimately leading to fundamental changes in privacy laws, stalking legislation, and how the entertainment industry approaches fan interactions and celebrity security. Rebecca Schaeffer was a rising young actress best known for her role as Patty Russell on the CBS sitcom My Sister Sam, a popular show that aired from 1986 to 1988 and had made the 21-year-old actress a recognizable face in American households. She was talented, beautiful, and on the verge of even greater success, having recently auditioned for a role in The Godfather Part 3 and receiving serious consideration for parts that could have launched her into major film stardom. Robert John Bardo was a 19-year-old drifter from Tucson, Arizona, who had become obsessed with Schaeffer after seeing her on television, developing an elaborate parasocial relationship where he believed he had a special connection with the actress despite never having met her or received any actual communication from her. Bardo's obsession with celebrities wasn't new. He had previously been infatuated with child actress Samantha Smith and pop star Debbie Gibson, but his fixation on Rebecca Schaeffer became all-consuming, dominating his thoughts and eventually motivating him to travel to Los Angeles to meet her. Between 1987 and 1989, Bardo wrote numerous letters to Schaeffer, some of which were forwarded to her by the studio, though she never responded personally, a fact that Bardo interpreted through the distorted lens of his delusion rather than accepting as a clear lack of interest. He visited the CBS studio lot where My Sister Sam was filmed, managing to evade security and actually meet Schaeffer briefly in 1987, an encounter where she was gracious and polite, signing an autograph and posing for a photo with him, professional courtesy that Bardo misinterpreted as evidence of a special connection between them. This brief meeting, rather than satisfying his obsession, intensified it, giving him what he considered validation that they had a relationship, however much that belief existed only in his disturbed mind. After My Sister Sam was canceled in 1988, Bardo continued following Schaeffer's career, reading entertainment magazines, and maintaining his obsessive focus on the actress. In 1989, when he saw Schaeffer in a bedroom scene with another actor in the film, Scenes from the Class Struggle in Beverly Hills, Bardo's obsession took a dark turn, and his feelings transformed from what he characterized as love into a volatile mixture of betrayal, anger, and possessiveness. The sexual scene shattered Bardo's idealized image of Schaeffer, and he began to feel that she had become corrupted by Hollywood, that she had betrayed the pure image he had constructed, and that she needed to be punished for this perceived transgression. This psychological shift from obsessive admiration to violent rage is common in cases of erotomanic stalking and demonstrates how dangerous these fixations can become when the fantasy relationship constructed by the stalker is contradicted by reality. Bardo began planning to confront Schaeffer, initially considering various scenarios but eventually settling on a plan to visit her home, though his exact intentions remained ambiguous even to himself until the final moments. The ease with which Bardo was able to locate Rebecca Schaeffer's home address reveals a systemic problem that would later be addressed through legal reform, but that, in 1989, left celebrities vulnerable to anyone determined to find them. Bardo hired a private investigator who, for a small fee, used California Department of Motor Vehicles records to obtain Schaeffer's home address, a service that was perfectly legal at the time but that demonstrated how accessible private information could be to anyone willing to pay for it. Armed with her address, Bardo traveled from Tucson to Los Angeles on July 18, 1989, carrying a gun he had obtained from a friend in Tennessee and a copy of J.D. Salinger's The Catcher in the Rye, a book that had also been carried by other celebrity stalkers and assassins, including Mark David Chapman when he murdered John Lennon. Bardo arrived at Schaeffer's apartment building in the Fairfax district early in the morning and rang her doorbell, a moment that would end the young actress's life and send shockwaves through the entertainment industry and American society. When Schaeffer answered the door, she was polite but firm, asking Bardo to leave, which he did initially, walking away from the building and spending time in a nearby diner. However, Bardo returned to Schaeffer's building a second time later that morning, rang the doorbell again, and when Rebecca answered the door for the second time, he pulled out the gun and shot her once in the chest at point-blank range. The single .357 caliber bullet struck Rebecca Schaeffer in the chest, penetrating her heart and causing catastrophic injuries. She staggered back into her apartment building and collapsed in the doorway of a neighboring unit, dying a short time later despite efforts by neighbors to help her and the rapid response of emergency services. Bardo fled the scene immediately after shooting Schaeffer, leaving Los Angeles and eventually making his way back toward Arizona. But his behavior on the journey betrayed his psychological state and ultimately led to his capture. He was walking down a busy highway in Tucson, darting in and out of traffic in a disturbed state, when police officers stopped to check on him, concerned about his erratic behavior and the danger he posed to motorists and himself. During this interaction with police, Bardo admitted to shooting Rebecca Schaeffer, providing enough detail that officers immediately took him into custody and contacted Los Angeles authorities. His confession and the physical evidence, including the gun and ammunition, provided overwhelming proof of his guilt, and he was transported back to Los Angeles to face murder charges. The investigation revealed the full extent of Bardo's obsession, including the letters he had written, the previous contact he had made with Schaeffer, and his journal entries that documented his deteriorating mental state and growing anger toward the actress. Bardo was charged with first-degree murder, and his trial in 1991 became a media sensation that highlighted the vulnerability of celebrities to obsessed fans and the inadequacy of existing laws to prevent such tragedies. His defense attorneys argued that Bardo suffered from mental illness and that the murder was not premeditated, pointing to his diagnosed schizophrenia and erotomania as mitigating factors that should reduce the charge to second-degree murder or manslaughter. However, prosecutors successfully argued that Bardo's extensive planning, his travel to Los Angeles specifically to confront Schaeffer, and his obtaining of a weapon demonstrated premeditation and consciousness of wrongdoing despite any mental health issues. The jury found Robert John Bardo guilty of first-degree murder, and he was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, a sentence he is still serving in California's prison system more than 3 decades later. The murder of Rebecca Schaeffer had immediate and far-reaching consequences for privacy law, stalking legislation, and celebrity security protocols. Within a year of her death, California passed legislation restricting access to DMV records, making it illegal for private investigators and others to obtain home addresses from motor vehicle records without a legitimate legal purpose, closing the loophole that Bardo had exploited to find Schaeffer. This law, often called the Rebecca Schaeffer Law, became a model for federal legislation, and similar protections were eventually implemented nationwide through the Driver's Privacy Protection Act of 1994. California also strengthened its anti-stalking laws in the wake of Schaeffer's murder, making stalking a felony under certain circumstances and giving law enforcement more tools to intervene before stalking escalated to violence. The entertainment industry fundamentally changed how it approached celebrity security, with studios, management companies, and individual celebrities investing far more resources in personal protection, secure housing, and limiting the accessibility of personal information. Fan mail protocols changed dramatically, with studios and management companies implementing much more careful screening of letters and gifts, and celebrities being advised to maintain much stricter boundaries with fans rather than the accessible image that had been common in earlier eras. The case also contributed to broader cultural conversations about parasocial relationships, the psychological dangers of celebrity worship, and the responsibility of media and entertainment companies in managing fan interactions. Rebecca Schaeffer's family became advocates for victims' rights and anti-stalking legislation, using their tragedy to push for legal reforms that could prevent similar deaths in the future. Her sister, for whom the show My Sister Sam had been named in a meta-reference to their real relationship, spoke publicly about the loss and the need for better protections for public figures facing obsessive attention. The murder also influenced how mental health professionals and law enforcement approach cases of erotomania and celebrity fixation, leading to better understanding of the warning signs that an obsession might turn violent and more aggressive intervention when those signs appear. Robert John Bardo's case is studied in criminal psychology courses as a classic example of erotomanic stalking, demonstrating the progression from parasocial fantasy to violent action and the danger signs that preceded the murder. The fact that Bardo had previously contacted Schaeffer, visited her workplace, and written numerous letters provided a pattern that, with today's threat assessment protocols, would likely trigger more significant intervention, though whether such intervention would have prevented the tragedy remains unknowable. Rebecca Schaeffer's murder at age 21 cut short a promising life and career, robbing the world of her talent and her family of a beloved daughter and sister, while simultaneously exposing systemic failures in privacy protection and stalking prevention that led to important legal reforms. The case remains a watershed moment in American legal and cultural history, marking the point when society began to seriously grapple with the dangers of obsessive fan behavior and take concrete steps to protect potential victims from those whose admiration has curdled into something dangerous and deadly. Number 8. Anurag Chandra and the Temescal Valley Murders. Teen terror on a California highway. The case of Anurag Chandra represents a particularly horrifying example of road rage stalking that escalated to mass murder, demonstrating how quickly a confrontation can spiral into catastrophic violence when an individual becomes fixated on punishing perceived slights, and how the advent of social media has transformed the dynamics of youth behavior in ways that can have deadly consequences. On January 19, 2020, in Temescal Valley, California, a quiet community in Riverside County, 6 teenage boys were enjoying a Sunday evening together, engaging in the kind of harmless mischief that teenagers have participated in for generations, specifically ringing doorbells and running away, a prank known as Ding Dong Ditch that, while annoying to homeowners, represents relatively benign adolescent behavior. The group consisted of friends from local high schools, boys with their whole lives ahead of them, including 16-year-old Daniel Hawkins, 13-year-old Jacob Ivascu, 14-year-old Drake Ruiz, and 3 other teenagers who would survive the night but would be forever traumatized by what happened. The boys drove through neighborhoods in a Toyota Prius, taking turns ringing doorbells and filming their reactions, planning to share the videos on social media platforms like TikTok and Instagram, part of the modern teenage experience where experiences are documented and shared for peer validation and entertainment. At approximately 10:30 p.m., the boys rang the doorbell at a house on Majeska Summit Road where Anurag Chandra lived with his family, a seemingly random selection that would have catastrophic consequences none of them could have imagined. Anurag Chandra, a 42-year-old man, was inside his home when his doorbell rang, and upon discovering that no one was there when he answered, he became enraged rather than dismissing it as a harmless prank or minor annoyance. Chandra's response to this trivial incident was wildly disproportionate to the offense, revealing a personality type prone to explosive anger and an inability to regulate emotional responses to perceived disrespect. Rather than going back inside his house and moving on with his evening, Chandra made a decision that would destroy multiple families and end his own life as a free man. He got into his Infiniti Q50 sedan and began pursuing the Toyota Prius containing the 6 teenagers, initiating a high-speed chase through the dark roads of Temescal Valley. What followed was approximately 20 minutes of terrifying pursuit as Chandra chased the Prius at high speeds, often driving in excess of 100 miles per hour on winding residential roads, while the teenagers inside the car became increasingly frightened, realizing that this wasn't just a man trying to scare them, but someone who appeared intent on harming them. The boys called 911 during the chase, desperate for help, trying to explain to dispatchers that a man was chasing them aggressively, attempting to run them off the road, and that they feared for their lives, but help wouldn't arrive in time to prevent the tragedy. During the pursuit, Chandra repeatedly rammed his vehicle into the back of the Prius, using his larger, heavier car as a weapon against the teenagers who were desperately trying to escape from him. The driver of the Prius attempted various evasive maneuvers, turning down different streets, accelerating to try to create distance, and taking corners at dangerous speeds, but Chandra remained relentless in his pursuit, demonstrating a level of commitment to his violent intentions that went far beyond any rational response to a doorbell prank. Witnesses along the route reported seeing the two vehicles racing through neighborhoods at extreme speeds. Clearly not a typical traffic situation, but something dangerous and intentional, though most didn't realize they were witnessing a deliberate attempt at vehicular homicide until after the tragic conclusion. As the chase continued onto Temescal Canyon Road, a winding two-lane highway with limited shoulders and barriers protecting steep drop-offs, Chandra made his final, fatal attack on the vehicle containing the teenagers. He accelerated his Infiniti and struck the rear of the Prius with tremendous force, sending the smaller vehicle careening off the road, where it crashed through a barbed wire fence and plunged off an embankment, rolling violently down a steep hillside before coming to rest in a ravine far below the roadway. The impact and the subsequent tumbling descent caused catastrophic damage to the vehicle and horrific injuries to everyone inside, turning what had started as a fun evening among friends into a scene of unimaginable tragedy. 3 of the 6 teenagers were killed in the crash. 16-year-old Daniel Hawkins, 13-year-old Jacob Ivascu, and 14-year-old Drake Ruiz, each young man dying from the massive trauma inflicted by the violent crash. Their lives ended because a grown man couldn't tolerate the minor annoyance of a doorbell prank. The 3 surviving teenagers suffered serious injuries ranging from broken bones to traumatic brain injuries, requiring extensive medical treatment and facing long recoveries, both physical and psychological. After forcing the Prius off the road and watching it disappear over the embankment, Anurag Chandra didn't stop to check on the victims, didn't call for emergency services, and didn't wait for police. Instead, he fled the scene, driving back to his home as if he could simply return to normal life after committing mass murder. However, the investigation into the crash began immediately, with the 3 survivors able to provide information about the vehicle that had been chasing them and forcing them off the road, and physical evidence at the scene, including paint transfer and debris, helping investigators identify the type of car involved. Surveillance footage from homes along the pursuit route captured portions of the chase, providing investigators with additional evidence about the timeline and the aggressive nature of Chandra's driving. Within hours, investigators had identified Anurag Chandra as a suspect based on the vehicle description, witness statements, and the fact that his home was where the doorbell incident had occurred, establishing the motive and connecting him directly to the crime. Officers went to Chandra's home early the next morning, January 20, 2020, where they found his Infiniti with obvious damage consistent with ramming another vehicle and with paint transfer matching the victim's Prius. Chandra was arrested without incident and taken into custody, initially claiming he didn't know what police were talking about, but the overwhelming physical and testimonial evidence made his denials futile. During the investigation, detectives discovered that Chandra had been home with his wife and young daughter when the doorbell rang, and his wife had actually tried to stop him from pursuing the boys, begging him to let it go and come back inside. But he had ignored her pleas and left anyway, a detail that underscored how easily this tragedy could have been prevented if Chandra had exercised even minimal self-control or listened to reason. Investigators also learned that Chandra had no prior criminal record of violence and no documented history that would have predicted this level of homicidal rage, making the case a stark example of how quickly normal life can transform into criminal violence when anger and poor judgment converge. Anurag Chandra was charged with 3 counts of first-degree murder, 3 counts of attempted murder, and multiple other felonies related to the chase and crash, with prosecutors arguing that his sustained pursuit and repeated ramming of the vehicle demonstrated clear premeditation and intent to kill, not merely reckless driving or manslaughter. The case garnered national attention as details emerged about how a doorbell prank had led to the deaths of 3 teenagers, with many people expressing shock that an adult could respond to such a minor incident with lethal violence. The families of Daniel Hawkins, Jacob Ivascu, and Drake Ruiz were devastated by their losses, suddenly having to plan funerals for sons who should have been planning their futures, attending school dances, and enjoying their teenage years. Community vigils were held throughout Riverside County, with hundreds of people gathering to mourn the boys and support their families. Many participants expressing anger that 3 young lives had been extinguished over something so trivial. Chandra's trial began in 2023, more than 3 years after the murders, with prosecutors presenting overwhelming evidence of his guilt, including the physical evidence from his vehicle, surveillance footage showing the pursuit, testimony from the surviving teenagers describing the terror of being chased and repeatedly rammed, and expert reconstruction of the crash demonstrating that the Prius was deliberately forced off the road. The defense attempted to argue for lesser charges, suggesting that while Chandra's actions were criminal, they didn't constitute premeditated murder but rather reckless manslaughter driven by temporary rage. But this argument failed to persuade the jury given the sustained nature of the pursuit and the clear opportunities Chandra had to disengage but chose not to take. Throughout the trial, family members of the victims attended court, wanting to ensure that justice was served for their sons and to bear witness to the legal process that would determine Chandra's fate. Victim impact statements delivered during the sentencing phase were heartbreaking, with parents describing the permanent void left in their lives, siblings talking about growing up without their brothers, and friends expressing their trauma and survivor's guilt. On February 24, 2023, the jury found Anurag Chandra guilty of 3 counts of first-degree murder and 3 counts of attempted murder, along with other charges, rejecting the defense's argument that the murders weren't premeditated and accepting the prosecution's theory that Chandra had decided to kill these teenagers and pursued that goal with determination over an extended period. In April 2023, Chandra was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, ensuring that he would never be free again, spending the rest of his life behind bars for the murders he committed over a doorbell prank. The judge, during sentencing, spoke about the senselessness of the crime, the devastating impact on multiple families, and the fact that 3 promising young lives had been extinguished because an adult man couldn't control his temper over a trivial annoyance, calling it one of the most tragic cases he had encountered in his judicial career. The case sparked broader conversations about road rage, the dangers of escalating minor confrontations, and the importance of adults modeling appropriate conflict resolution for young people rather than responding to perceived slights with violence. Juvenile law experts and child psychologists discussed how doorbell ditching, while technically trespassing and annoying to homeowners, is a common adolescent behavior that has been part of American youth culture for generations and that appropriate responses include ignoring it, speaking to the children if caught, or at most calling police to give them a warning, not vehicular homicide. The tragedy also raised questions about the impact of social media on teenage behavior, as the boys had been recording their pranks for online posting. Though experts were quick to note that while social media may have motivated the specific activity that night, teenagers have been engaging in similar mischief long before TikTok existed, and the responsibility for the murders rests entirely with Chandra, not with the victims or their innocent behavior. The surviving teenagers faced long roads to recovery, not just from their physical injuries, but from the psychological trauma of surviving a deliberate attempt on their lives and losing their friends in such horrific circumstances. Daniel Hawkins, Jacob Ivascu, and Drake Ruiz are remembered by their families and communities as bright, kind young men who died far too soon, their potential unfulfilled, their families forever incomplete, all because they encountered a man who valued his pride more than human life and who responded to a childish prank with murderous rage. Number 7. Jodi Arias and Travis Alexander. The Phoenix bathroom murder. The murder of Travis Alexander by his ex-girlfriend Jodi Arias on June 4, 2008, in Mesa, Arizona, stands as one of the most notorious cases of fatal attraction and relationship stalking in American criminal history. A case that captivated the nation with its combination of sex, religion, obsession, and extreme violence, ultimately resulting in one of the most watched trials in recent decades. Travis Victor Alexander was a 30-year-old motivational speaker and salesman for prepaid legal services, a charismatic man who was deeply involved in the Mormon Church and who presented an image of success, confidence, and religious devotion to his community and business associates. Jodi Arias was a 28-year-old woman from California who met Travis in September 2006 at a business convention in Las Vegas, where they were both immediately attracted to each other, beginning a relationship that would prove toxic, volatile, and ultimately fatal. Their relationship was complicated from the start by the tension between Travis's commitment to Mormon values, which emphasized chastity before marriage, and the intense sexual relationship he and Jodi engaged in almost immediately after meeting, a contradiction that Travis struggled with internally and that created conflict between them. Jodi converted to Mormonism and was baptized into the faith, partly out of genuine spiritual interest but largely to please Travis and to integrate herself into his world, moving from California to Mesa, Arizona, to be closer to him. The relationship was intense and passionate, but also troubled by jealousy, possessiveness, and fundamental incompatibility, with Travis increasingly recognizing that Jodi was not someone he wanted to marry or build a life with, despite their continued sexual involvement. By early 2007, Travis attempted to break off the romantic relationship with Jodi while still maintaining some level of friendship and continued sexual contact, a confused situation that Jodi refused to accept as final, instead clinging to hope that they would eventually end up together permanently. As Travis began dating other women and making it clear to friends that Jodi was not his girlfriend despite their ongoing contact, Jodi's behavior became increasingly obsessive and concerning, demonstrating classic stalking patterns that those around Travis recognized as problematic but that he continued to tolerate and enable through his inability to completely cut contact with her. Jodi would show up uninvited at Travis's house, hack into his social media and email accounts to monitor who he was communicating with, and display intense jealousy toward any woman Travis showed interest in, behavior that Travis's friends found alarming and that they repeatedly warned him about. Travis's friends noticed that Jodi would sometimes listen to Travis's voicemails, read his text messages, and demonstrate detailed knowledge of his activities and conversations that she shouldn't have had access to, indicating she was engaged in surveillance and digital stalking that went beyond normal relationship boundaries. Despite multiple breakups and Travis explicitly telling friends that Jodi was crazy and that he was trying to distance himself from her, the sexual relationship continued intermittently, with Travis showing poor judgment in maintaining any contact with someone who had demonstrated such obsessive behavior. By late 2007 and early 2008, Jodi had moved back to California but continued to communicate with Travis and occasionally visit Arizona, still harboring hopes of reconciliation while Travis moved forward with his life and began seriously dating other women with marriage in mind. In the spring of 2008, Travis had met a woman he was genuinely interested in and was planning a trip to Cancun, Mexico, with her, a development that represented Travis finally moving on to a healthy relationship and signaling the definitive end of any future with Jodi. This prospect of Travis permanently moving on with someone else appeared to trigger something in Jodi, and her behavior in the weeks leading up to June 2008 showed signs of escalating obsession and planning. In late May 2008, Jodi borrowed a gas can from a friend, then rented a car, telling those around her that she was taking a road trip to visit a male friend in Utah, creating a cover story for what would actually be a trip to Mesa with murderous intent. On June 2, 2008, Jodi rented a white Ford Focus, specifically requesting a car that wasn't red because she claimed red cars attracted too much attention from police, a detail that would later seem significant given her plans. She filled gas cans before leaving California and made other preparations that suggested she was planning to make the trip to Mesa without creating the usual trail of evidence like credit card receipts at Arizona gas stations. On June 4, 2008, despite claiming she was nowhere near Arizona, Jodi arrived at Travis's house in Mesa, and based on phone records and photo evidence recovered later, Travis allowed her inside and they spent time together, including engaging in sexual activity that was photographed with Travis's camera, images that would become crucial evidence in the subsequent investigation. The photographs recovered from Travis's camera, which Jodi had attempted to destroy, provided a timeline of the last hours of Travis's life, showing intimate photos taken in the early afternoon, then Travis posing in his shower around 5:30 p.m., and then a series of accidental photos taken during the attack that captured glimpses of Travis's body in various states and Jodi's leg and foot, proving definitively that she was present during the murder. What happened in Travis Alexander's bathroom on the evening of June 4, 2008, was an explosion of violence so extreme that it shocked even experienced homicide detectives who had seen countless crime scenes throughout their careers. Travis was attacked while he was in the shower, initially stabbed in the heart area, and then subjected to a prolonged assault involving 27 to 29 separate stab wounds, a slashed throat so deep it nearly decapitated him, and a gunshot wound to the head, an amount of violence that went far beyond what was necessary to kill him and that indicated rage, passion, and overkill typical of personal relationship homicides. The medical examiner determined that Travis had defensive wounds on his hands and head, indicating he tried to defend himself against the attack, and that he remained conscious at least initially despite his injuries, likely suffering terribly before he finally died. The sequence of injuries and the physical evidence suggested that after the initial attack, Travis, despite being grievously wounded, attempted to get away from his attacker, making it to the hallway outside the bathroom where he was pursued and where the attack continued until he was finally dead. After murdering Travis, Jodi engaged in efforts to clean up the crime scene, though her attempts were ultimately incomplete and left significant evidence behind. She put Travis's body in the shower, possibly attempting to wash away blood evidence, ran the washing machine with items including the camera that contained the incriminating photos, though the deleted images were later recovered by forensic experts, and attempted to clean blood from various surfaces, though luminol testing would later reveal blood evidence throughout the bathroom and hallway. Jodi then left Travis's house, began the drive back to Utah to establish her alibi, and acted as if nothing had happened, even showing up to her supposed destination and spending time with the man she had claimed she was visiting, creating interactions and memories with him that were meant to establish that she had been in Utah on June 4th, not in Arizona committing murder. Travis Alexander's body wasn't discovered until June 9, 2008, 5 days after the murder, when concerned friends who hadn't been able to reach him and knew he had missed a scheduled work trip to Cancun went to his house and made the horrific discovery of his badly decomposed body still in the shower where Jodi had left him. The crime scene was gruesome, with blood evidence throughout the bathroom and hallway, and the level of violence was immediately apparent to the friends who found him and the police who responded, indicating this was a crime of passion rather than a robbery or random attack. Investigators immediately began looking at people in Travis's life who might have had motive to kill him, and Jodi Arias's name came up quickly given her known obsessive behavior and the recent history of their troubled relationship. When police contacted Jodi to inform her of Travis's death and ask if she had any information, she acted shocked and bereaved, but her performance was unconvincing to detectives who noted inconsistencies in her statements and her strange effect when discussing the murder. Initially, Jodi claimed she hadn't been to Travis's house in months and knew nothing about the murder, suggesting that Travis had been receiving threats and that perhaps drug dealers or religious extremists had killed him. Stories that investigators found implausible given the intimate nature of the crime scene and the lack of evidence supporting these alternative theories. As the investigation progressed and forensic evidence from the scene was analyzed, the recovered photographs from Travis's camera proved that Jodi had been present at the house on June 4th, directly contradicting her alibi and establishing her as the prime suspect. The camera contained not only the intimate photos from earlier in the day and the shower photos of Travis shortly before his death, but also the accidental photos taken during the attack, including one showing Travis's body on the bathroom floor with Jodi's pant leg and foot visible in the frame, essentially documenting her presence during the murder. Additional evidence mounted against Jodi, including DNA evidence, the rental car that had been returned with suspicious stains and missing floor mats, her purchase of gas cans before the trip that suggested she wanted to avoid stopping at gas stations in Arizona, where she might be recorded on surveillance cameras, and inconsistencies in her timeline that placed her in Arizona despite her claims of being in Utah. On July 15, 2008, Jodi Arias was arrested at her grandparents' home in Northern California, where she had been staying since the murder, and was charged with first-degree murder in the death of Travis Alexander, facing the possibility of the death penalty if convicted. After her arrest and facing overwhelming evidence of her presence at the crime scene, Jodi changed her story, now admitting she had been at Travis's house on June 4th, but claiming that two masked intruders had broken in, attacked Travis, and threatened her, forcing her to flee rather than call police. A story that detectives found even less credible than her initial denial. Finally, as her trial approached, Jodi changed her story again, this time claiming that she had killed Travis, but only in self-defense after he became violent and threatening, alleging that Travis had attacked her and that she had defended herself, a claim that would become her defense at trial despite being her third completely different account of what happened. The trial of Jodi Arias began in January 2013, more than 4 years after the murder, and became a media sensation, with wall-to-wall coverage on cable news networks, extensive social media discussion, and public fascination with the lurid details of the case, the sexual nature of the relationship, and Jodi's behavior on the witness stand. The prosecution presented overwhelming forensic evidence proving that Jodi had killed Travis, including the photographs, DNA evidence, the impossibility of her intruder story, and the extreme violence of the attack, which contradicted any self-defense claim. Jodi took the stand in her own defense, spending 18 days testifying, an unusually long time that allowed prosecutors extensive opportunity for cross-examination and that revealed numerous inconsistencies, lies, and manipulations in her various accounts. During her testimony, Jodi attempted to portray Travis as abusive and sexually deviant, making claims about his behavior that his friends and family vehemently denied and that were contradicted by the evidence of her stalking behavior and his attempts to distance himself from her. The trial included explicit testimony about the sexual relationship between Jodi and Travis, playing of phone sex recordings, discussion of Travis's religious guilt about sex outside marriage, and intimate details that captivated the public but that defense attorneys argued was necessary to explain the dynamics of their relationship and support the self-defense claim. Prosecutors systematically destroyed Jodi's credibility, highlighting her multiple conflicting stories, catching her in lies during cross-examination, and demonstrating that the physical evidence contradicted her self-defense narrative, particularly the excessive number of wounds and the evidence that Travis had been attacked from behind while in the shower, unable to pose any threat to Jodi. On May 8, 2013, after deliberating for 15 hours over 4 days, the jury found Jodi Arias guilty of first-degree murder, rejecting her self-defense claim and accepting the prosecution's argument that she had murdered Travis in a jealous rage over his relationship with another woman and his final rejection of any future with her. The penalty phase of the trial, which would determine whether Jodi received the death penalty or life in prison, resulted in a deadlocked jury unable to reach a unanimous decision, leading to a second penalty phase trial in 2015 with a new jury. The second penalty phase jury also deadlocked on the death penalty, which under Arizona law meant that the judge imposed a sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole, ensuring that Jodi Arias would spend the rest of her life behind bars for the murder of Travis Alexander. The case of Jodi Arias and Travis Alexander illustrates the deadly potential of obsessive relationships, the danger of continuing contact with someone who has demonstrated stalking behavior, and the catastrophic consequences when rejection and jealousy combine with a willingness to use violence. Travis Alexander's murder was preventable in the sense that the warning signs of Jodi's obsession were apparent to Travis's friends and to Travis himself, but his inability or unwillingness to completely sever contact with her created opportunities that ultimately cost him his life. The extreme violence of the murder, with nearly 30 stab wounds and a near decapitation, demonstrated the rage and passion behind the attack, contradicting any claim of self-defense and revealing the true nature of what happened as a jealous ex-girlfriend's ultimate act of possession and revenge. The trial's extensive media coverage brought national attention to issues of domestic violence, stalking in relationships, and the warning signs that someone may be dangerous, though it also raised concerns about the sensationalistic coverage of violent crimes and the way trials can become entertainment rather than somber judicial proceedings. Travis Alexander's family has remained vocal about their loss, remembering Travis as a vibrant, successful man whose life was stolen by someone who claimed to love him but whose love was actually a possessive obsession that couldn't tolerate rejection or the prospect of Travis being happy with someone else. Jodi Arias remains in prison in Arizona, where she has continued to maintain media presence through interviews and social media managed by others, behavior that Travis's family finds disrespectful and that demonstrates her continued narcissism and inability to take genuine responsibility for her crime. The case remains one of the most discussed true crime cases of the modern era, a cautionary tale about the dangers of toxic relationships, the importance of recognizing stalking behavior, and the terrible price that can be paid when warning signs are ignored and contact is maintained with someone who has demonstrated obsessive and possessive tendencies. Number 6. Dorothy Jane Scott, the mystery caller and the burning car. The unsolved murder of Dorothy Jane Scott represents one of the most chilling cases of stalking and abduction in American history, a mystery that has haunted investigators and true crime enthusiasts for more than 4 decades. Involving a terrifying campaign of anonymous phone calls, a bold abduction from a hospital parking lot, and a murder that remains officially unsolved despite strong theories about the perpetrator's identity. Dorothy Jane Scott was a 32-year-old single mother living in Stanton, California, in 1980, working as a secretary at Swinger's Psychedelic Shop, later renamed Custom John's Head Shop, a business in Anaheim that sold various items including waterbeds and counterculture merchandise. Dorothy was devoted to her 4-year-old son Sean, living with her parents to help care for him while she worked, and was described by everyone who knew her as responsible, kind, and competent, the type of person who could always be relied upon to do the right thing. In the months leading up to her disappearance, Dorothy had been receiving disturbing phone calls from an unknown man who seemed to know intimate details about her life, her movements, and her daily routine, indicating that she was being watched and stalked even though she couldn't identify who was responsible. The caller would make bizarre statements, sometimes romantic and sometimes threatening, telling Dorothy what she had been wearing that day, where she had been, what she had done, demonstrating that he was surveilling her constantly and wanted her to know she was being watched. Dorothy reported these calls to police, but in 1980, law enforcement had limited tools to investigate such harassment, particularly when the caller had not made explicit threats of violence and when Dorothy couldn't identify who might be responsible for the calls. The stalking and phone calls had been escalating over several months, creating an atmosphere of fear and anxiety in Dorothy's life as she tried to figure out who was obsessed with her and what they might ultimately do. On the evening of May 28, 1980, Dorothy was at work when a coworker named Conrad Bostrom became ill, showing symptoms that concerned Dorothy and another colleague, Pam Head, both of whom agreed that Conrad needed medical attention. Dorothy volunteered to drive Conrad and Pam to UC Irvine Medical Center in Orange, California, using her own car to transport her ailing coworker to get treatment, an act of kindness that would lead directly to her abduction and murder. They arrived at the hospital around 8:30 p.m., with Dorothy and Pam accompanying Conrad into the emergency room and waiting while he was examined and treated for what turned out to be a severe allergic reaction to a spider bite. After Conrad was treated and released around 10:45 p.m., the three of them left the emergency room and headed toward the parking lot where Dorothy had parked her car, a 1973 Toyota station wagon, planning to return to Anaheim and end what had been a stressful evening. However, when they reached the area where Dorothy had parked, she told Conrad and Pam to wait at the entrance to the ER while she went to get the car and picked them up, a decision that may have been prompted by something she saw or sensed in the parking lot, or may have simply been an attempt to spare Conrad, who was still feeling unwell, the walk to the car. Conrad and Pam waited at the entrance, expecting Dorothy to pull up within a few minutes, but when her car appeared, it didn't stop at the curb where they were waiting. Instead, it sped past them out of the parking lot at high speed, with Dorothy visible in the driver's seat but appearing to be in distress. staring straight ahead rather than acknowledging her friends. Conrad and Pam were confused and concerned, unable to understand why Dorothy would speed away without picking them up as planned, and they waited for her to return, thinking perhaps she had forgotten something or made a mistake, but she never came back. As minutes turned into an hour with no sign of Dorothy, Conrad and Pam began to realize something was seriously wrong, and they contacted police to report that their friend had driven away from the hospital in strange circumstances and couldn't be reached. What Conrad and Pam didn't know at the time was that someone had been hiding in Dorothy's car, waiting for her to return to it, and had confronted or threatened her when she got in, forcing her to drive away with him or possibly taking control of the vehicle himself while holding her at gunpoint or knife point, abducting her from the hospital parking lot in front of dozens of other people who simply saw a car driving away and had no idea they were witnessing a kidnapping. The abduction from a busy hospital parking lot in the late evening demonstrated extreme boldness on the part of the perpetrator and suggested someone who had been watching Dorothy closely enough to know she would be at that hospital that night, supporting the theory that this was her stalker finally making his move. Police began investigating immediately after the missing person report was filed, treating the case seriously given the unusual circumstances of Dorothy's disappearance and her previous reports of being stalked and harassed by phone. On June 13, 1980, about 2 weeks after Dorothy's disappearance, her body was discovered by construction workers in rural Santa Ana Canyon, a remote area about 10 miles from the hospital where she was abducted. Her remains were badly burned, having been intentionally set on fire in what investigators believed was an attempt to destroy evidence and prevent identification, though dental records ultimately confirmed that the body was Dorothy Jane Scott. The autopsy was unable to determine an exact cause of death due to the condition of the remains, though investigators believed she had likely been murdered shortly after her abduction and then her body was burned and dumped in the remote location. For months later, in August 1980, Dorothy's Toyota station wagon was found completely burned out in a Ventura County alley, the fire having destroyed most potential forensic evidence and making it nearly impossible for investigators to learn anything from the vehicle about who had taken Dorothy or what had happened to her. The discovery of the burned car seemed to close off one of the few potential sources of physical evidence in the case, leaving investigators with very limited forensic material to work with and forcing them to rely primarily on witness statements and circumstantial evidence to try to identify Dorothy's killer. Then, in the most disturbing development in an already horrifying case, Dorothy's mother began receiving phone calls from a man who claimed to be Dorothy's killer, calls that continued intermittently for years after the murder, representing a level of sadistic cruelty that shocked even experienced homicide investigators. The caller would tell Dorothy's mother where Dorothy's body had been found before the information was public, providing details that only the killer would know, confirming that he was indeed responsible for her death and not just a sick prankster. He would taunt her about her daughter's death, sometimes asking, "Is Dorothy home?" Or, "Are you still looking for your daughter?" Comments designed to cause maximum psychological pain and to assert his power over the family by reminding them that he had killed Dorothy and had never been caught. These calls continued sporadically throughout the 1980s and possibly into the early 1990s, though they eventually stopped, either because the caller died, lost interest, or was imprisoned for another crime. The investigation into Dorothy's murder pursued multiple theories and suspects over the years, but despite extensive detective work, no one has ever been charged with her killing, making it one of Orange County's most frustrating unsolved homicides. Investigators developed several suspects over the years, including men who had known Dorothy through work or social connections, but evidence was always insufficient to bring charges, and some suspects died before the investigation could definitively exclude or implicate them. One particular suspect was a man who had worked in the same business complex as Dorothy's employer and who had shown unusual interest in her, but he died by suicide shortly after Dorothy's murder under circumstances that some investigators found suspicious, leading to speculation that he might have been the stalker and killer and that his suicide was motivated by guilt or fear of being caught. However, Without confession or definitive physical evidence linking him to the crime, his involvement remains speculative, and the case officially remains unsolved. The phone calls to Dorothy's mother represented one of the most psychologically cruel aspects of the case, demonstrating that Dorothy's killer wasn't satisfied with merely taking her life, but wanted to continue torturing her family afterward by reminding them of their loss and his ability to evade justice. The fact that he called repeatedly over years suggested someone who derived pleasure from the family's suffering and who felt confident enough in his ability to avoid detection that he was willing to maintain contact with the victim's family, a level of arrogance and sadism that is relatively rare even in homicide cases. Some true crime researchers and amateur investigators have continued examining Dorothy's case over the years, generating new theories and conducting their own research, though none have produced the breakthrough that would finally identify her killer with certainty. The case has been featured in numerous true crime documentaries, podcasts, and articles, each retelling bringing renewed attention and sometimes generating new tips, though as of now, the identity of Dorothy's stalker and killer remains unknown. Dorothy's son Sean was only 4 years old when his mother was murdered, losing her at an age where he had just begun forming lasting memories. And he was raised by his grandparents who had to cope with both their grief at losing their daughter and their responsibility for raising her child. The psychological impact on Sean of growing up knowing his mother was stalked, abducted, and murdered by someone who was never brought to justice is profound, representing the ripple effects of unsolved murders that extend across generations. Dorothy Jane Scott's case illustrates several important aspects of stalking cases that remain relevant today. The difficulty victims face in getting stalking behavior taken seriously before violence occurs, the importance of documenting harassment and reporting it to authorities even when immediate action seems unlikely, and the terrifying reality that stalkers often possess detailed knowledge of their victims' routines and movements, making them difficult to evade even when the victim is aware of the danger. The fact that Dorothy was taken from a hospital parking lot while doing a favor for a sick coworker adds a tragic irony to the case, showing how an act of kindness led directly to her encountering her killer in a location she wouldn't normally have been at that time of night. The boldness of abducting someone from a hospital parking lot also demonstrates the perpetrator's confidence and planning, suggesting this wasn't an impulsive act but rather the culmination of a stalking campaign that had been building for months. Modern investigative techniques, including DNA analysis and genetic genealogy, offer some hope that Dorothy's case might eventually be solved, particularly if the perpetrator's DNA was recovered from her body or clothing and can be compared to genealogical databases that have proven successful in solving other cold cases from the same era. However, the extensive burning of both Dorothy's body and her car may have destroyed crucial evidence that would have made such modern techniques more viable, representing one of the unfortunate realities of cases from the pre-DNA era where perpetrators could more easily destroy evidence. Dorothy's family has never given up hope that her case will be solved, participating in media coverage and cooperating with investigators who periodically review the case with fresh eyes or new technology, determined that Dorothy's killer should be identified and that justice, however delayed, should eventually be served. The Orange County Sheriff's Department maintains Dorothy's case as an active unsolved homicide and encourages anyone with information, no matter how seemingly insignificant, to come forward, as even small details can sometimes provide the missing piece that solves a decades-old mystery. Dorothy Jane Scott's murder remains a haunting example of how stalking can escalate to abduction and murder, how perpetrators can evade justice even in cases where their general profile is known, and how the lack of closure in unsolved cases creates ongoing trauma for families who never receive answers about what happened to their loved one or why, living with uncertainty and grief that never fully resolves because the story never truly ends. Number 5. Paula Gutshall and Gregory Green. Domestic terror in Detroit. The case of Paula Gutshall and Gregory Green represents a horrifying example of domestic violence and stalking that escalated from threatening behavior to mass murder, demonstrating how intimate partner violence can pose dangers not just to the primary victim but to everyone around them. including children who become collateral damage in acts of vengeful violence. Paula Gutshall and Gregory Green had been in an on-and-off relationship for years, a volatile partnership characterized by Green's controlling behavior, jealousy, and violence, patterns that are typical in domestic abuse situations, but that escalated far beyond typical intimate partner violence to become one of Detroit's most shocking family murders. Paula, a mother of 4, had been trying to extricate herself from her relationship with Gregory Green, recognizing that he was dangerous and that remaining involved with him put herself and her children at risk. But like many domestic violence victims, she found leaving to be far more complicated and dangerous than outsiders might imagine. Gregory Green had a history of violence and controlling behavior, displaying classic characteristics of an abuser including extreme jealousy, possessiveness, and rage at the prospect of Paula having independence or relationships with anyone else, viewing her as his property rather than as an autonomous individual with rights and choices. In the weeks and months leading up to the murders, Paula had been taking steps to distance herself from Green, moving toward a final separation, but Green had made it clear through his statements and behavior that he would not accept Paula moving on with her life, making threats that should have been taken as clear warnings of the violence to come. On the evening of September 21, 2016, Gregory Green's threats became reality when he carried out a planned attack that would leave 5 people dead, including 3 children, in a Detroit home on Harding Street on the city's west side. Green arrived at the home where Paula was staying with her children and other family members, armed with a handgun and clearly intent on carrying out the threats he had been making, entering the residence and opening fire on everyone inside in an act of violence so extreme that it shocked even a city familiar with violent crime. Gregory Green shot and killed Paula Gutshall, the woman he had claimed to love but whom he viewed as a possession he would rather destroy than allow to be independent. He murdered Paula's daughter Kara Allen, age 25, a young woman with her whole life ahead of her who died trying to protect her mother or simply because she was present when Green decided to destroy everyone Paula cared about. He killed Kara's twin 5-year-old daughters, Kaylee and Kaylee Gutshall, 2 innocent children who had no understanding of adult relationship violence and who died in what should have been the safety of their own home. Their lives ended before they had barely begun simply because they were related to the woman Green wanted to punish. Green also shot and seriously wounded Chloe Allen, Kara's 6-month-old baby, who survived with critical injuries but was left motherless and severely traumatized by the violence inflicted upon her. After killing 4 people and severely wounding an infant, Gregory Green turned the gun on himself, committing suicide at the scene, a final act of control that ensured he would never face justice for the murders he had committed and that robbed the victim's family of any opportunity for legal accountability or answers about why he had done this. The crime scene was horrific, with multiple victims in different parts of the home, evidence of the rapid and systematic nature of Green's attack, and the presence of young children among the dead adding an extra layer of tragedy to an already devastating situation. First responders who arrived at the scene encountered carnage that would haunt them, with a baby clinging to life amid the bodies of her mother, grandmother, and twin sisters, a scene that represented the absolute worst of domestic violence and its capacity to destroy entire families in moments. The investigation quickly established that this was a domestic violence murder-suicide, with Gregory Green as the perpetrator, motivated by his rage at Paula's attempts to leave him and his determination that if he couldn't have her, no one would, and that her family would be destroyed as punishment for her independence. Detectives learned that Green had a history of violence and threatening behavior, that Paula had been afraid of him, and that there had been warning signs that he was capable of lethal violence, though whether more could have been done to prevent the tragedy remains a painful question for investigators and advocates. The attack had been planned rather than purely impulsive, with Green bringing a weapon to the home and apparently waiting for an opportunity when multiple family members would be present, maximizing the destruction he could inflict and ensuring that Paula's loved ones would also pay the price for her attempt to leave him. The murders sent shockwaves through Detroit and the broader community, sparking conversations about domestic violence, the lethality of intimate partner homicide, and the vulnerability of children in homes where domestic violence is occurring. Domestic violence advocates pointed to the case as a stark example of why leaving an abusive relationship is the most dangerous time for victims, when the abuser's sense of control is threatened and when retaliatory violence is most likely, and why victims who are trying to leave need intensive support, safety planning, and sometimes law enforcement protection to survive the separation. The fact that Green had killed not only Paula but also her daughter and twin granddaughters demonstrated that perpetrators of domestic violence often target people the victim loves as a form of punishment. Understanding that destroying the victim's family causes suffering that extends beyond the victim's own death. The murder of 5-year-old twins Kaylee and Kaylee was particularly heartbreaking, two little girls who had done nothing wrong and who had no role in the adult relationship dynamics that led to their deaths, representing the ultimate innocence destroyed by adult violence. Baby Chloe's survival and injuries raised questions about whether Green had intended to kill her as well and failed, or whether she had been shot unintentionally in the chaos of the attack, though either way, the fact that he shot an infant demonstrated his complete abandonment of any moral constraint or humanity. Chloe was hospitalized with critical injuries and underwent medical treatment to save her life and address the trauma she had sustained, with family members stepping in to care for her after she lost her mother, grandmother, and sisters in one horrifying night. The impact on Paula's surviving family members was devastating, losing 4 loved ones simultaneously and having to cope with the reality that a baby in their family had been shot and would grow up never knowing her mother or sisters. Funerals for Paula, Kara, Kaylee, and Kaylee were held together, a heartbreaking service where 4 caskets represented 4 generations of one family destroyed by one man's violence, with community members, friends, and even strangers attending to show support and mourn the senseless loss. The tragedy sparked renewed calls for better domestic violence intervention, more resources for victims trying to leave abusive relationships, and criminal justice reforms that would allow more aggressive prosecution of domestic abusers before their violence escalates to homicide. Advocates noted that domestic violence homicides are often preventable if warning signs are recognized and acted upon, if victims have safe options for leaving, and if abusers face serious consequences for threatening or violent behavior before it escalates to the point of no return. The case also highlighted the importance of recognizing that domestic violence isn't just a problem between 2 adults but a family and community issue that can endanger children, other family members, and even first responders who must deal with the aftermath of such violence. Gregory Green's decision to commit suicide after the murders meant that many questions about his motivations, his planning, and whether he had considered the impact on the innocent children he killed would never be fully answered, leaving his victim's family without the closure that a trial might have provided. The fact that he killed himself rather than face accountability for his crimes is seen by many as a final act of cowardice and control, denying the justice system and the victim's family the opportunity to confront him with his crimes and see him punished. In the aftermath of the murders, domestic violence organizations in Detroit and nationwide used the case as a teaching example and training for law enforcement, social workers, and judges, illustrating the warning signs that preceded the violence and the importance of taking threats seriously when someone says they will harm their partner or family. The case contributed to ongoing efforts to improve threat assessment in domestic violence cases, to create better coordination between police, courts, and social services, and to ensure that victims who are trying to leave have access to safe housing, legal protection, and support services that can reduce the risk of retaliatory violence. Paula Gutschall's death, along with those of her daughter and granddaughters, represents not just a personal tragedy but a systemic failure to adequately protect domestic violence victims and the children caught in the crossfire of intimate partner violence. The murders illustrate how stalking and domestic violence in intimate relationships can be every bit as lethal as stranger stalking, and how the familiarity and access that intimate partners have can make their violence even more difficult to escape and potentially more deadly. Gregory Green's actions destroyed multiple generations of a family in a single night of violence, leaving a traumatized infant as the sole survivor and creating ripples of grief and trauma that extended through an entire community, a legacy of pain that stands as testament to the devastating consequences of domestic violence and the critical importance of taking threats seriously and protecting victims before violence escalates to the point of no return. Number 4. Elliot Rodger and the Isla Vista massacre. Incel ideology turned deadly. The case of Elliot Rodger represents a particularly disturbing intersection of stalking behavior, entitlement, misogyny, and mass violence, a crime that not only killed 6 people and injured 14 others, but also became a rallying point for a toxic online subculture and demonstrated how rejection and perceived romantic failure can fester into homicidal rage when combined with mental illness and extremist ideology. Elliot Oliver Robertson Rodger was a 22-year-old college student living in Isla Vista, California, near the University of California, Santa Barbara campus. A young man who came from a relatively privileged background as the son of a Hollywood director but who was consumed by bitterness, resentment, and rage over his inability to attract romantic or sexual attention from women. Rodger had spent years developing an elaborate worldview in which he was a victim of profound injustice, viewing himself as superior to other men but unfairly denied the female attention and sexual experiences he believed he deserved, creating a mental framework that blamed women for his isolation and other men for being chosen over him despite what he viewed as his obvious superiority. Throughout his late teens and early 20s, Rodger became increasingly isolated, spending enormous amounts of time online in communities that reinforced his misogynistic views and sense of victimhood, particularly forums dedicated to men who identified as involuntarily celibate or incels, a subculture characterized by extreme bitterness toward women and the men they choose to have relationships with. Rodger's participation in these online communities, combined with his underlying mental health issues, created a toxic feedback loop where his distorted views became increasingly extreme and where violence began to seem not just justified but necessary as a form of retribution against the women who rejected him and the society that he believed had failed to give him what he deserved. In the months leading up to his attack, Rodger began planning what he called his Day of Retribution, a planned massacre that he intended as revenge against women for rejecting him, against sexually successful men for making him feel inferior, and against humanity in general for creating a world where someone he considered as magnificent as himself could be lonely and unwanted. He purchased multiple firearms legally in California, despite having had concerning interactions with law enforcement and mental health professionals that perhaps should have triggered more serious intervention, though the gaps in California's gun control and mental health intervention systems at the time allowed him to acquire weapons without sufficient scrutiny. Rodger also created extensive documentation of his worldview and plans, including a 137-page manifesto titled My Twisted World, the story of Elliot Rodger that outlined his biography, his grievances, and his justifications for the violence he planned to commit, providing a disturbing window into the mind of someone consumed by narcissism, entitlement, and homicidal rage. He recorded YouTube videos in the days before the attack, including one posted the day before the massacre where he outlined his plans in general terms, expressed his hatred for women and sexually active men, and promised retribution for his years of loneliness and rejection, creating a record that would later be analyzed by psychologists, criminologists, and terrorism experts trying to understand the motivations behind his violence. On the evening of May 23, 2014, Elliot Rodger began his planned massacre by attacking his 2 roommates and their friend in his own apartment, stabbing all 3 men to death in a brutal assault that demonstrated his capacity for sustained violence and his commitment to his plan. The victims in the apartment were Chang Yuan Hong, George Chun, and Weihan Wang, 3 young men who happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time, killed by Rodger in the privacy of the apartment they shared with him, their bodies not discovered until after the subsequent public phase of his attack was already underway. After murdering his roommates, Rodger drove to the Alpha Phi sorority house at UC Santa Barbara, a location he had specifically targeted because he viewed sorority women as representing everything he hated about female sexuality and mate selection, women who he believed would never have given him attention but who were sexually active with other men he considered inferior to himself. He attempted to gain entry to the Alpha Phi house, pounding on the door and trying to force his way inside, apparently planning to murder as many sorority members as possible. But the door was locked and the women inside didn't open it, unknowingly saving their own lives by refusing entry to someone they had no reason to trust. Frustrated by his inability to get into the sorority house, Roger instead shot at people standing outside nearby, killing Catherine Cooper and Veronica Weiss, two sorority members who were outside the building, before driving away from the area and beginning a rampage through Isla Vista. For approximately 10 minutes, Roger drove through the streets of Isla Vista, shooting at pedestrians, striking people with his car, and engaging in running gun battles with police, creating a scene of chaos and terror in the normally peaceful college community. He shot and killed Christopher Michaels Martinez, a 20-year-old student who was inside a deli, fatally shooting him while firing randomly into the business, adding a sixth murder to the terrible toll. Roger also wounded 14 other people during his rampage, some shot and others struck by his vehicle as he drove erratically through the streets, creating multiple crime scenes across Isla Vista and forcing police to respond to numerous simultaneous reports of shootings and vehicle attacks. The rampage ended when Roger engaged in a gun battle with police officers who had located him, sustaining a gunshot wound during the exchange of fire, though forensic evidence later suggested that the fatal wound was likely self-inflicted rather than from police gunfire, with Roger apparently choosing to end his own life rather than be captured. His body was found in his crashed BMW, surrounded by weapons and ammunition, the physical end to a rampage that had lasted only minutes but had killed 6 people and traumatized an entire community. The investigation that followed Roger's death uncovered the extensive documentation he had created, including his manifesto, videos, and online postings, providing investigators and the public with unprecedented insight into his motivations, planning, and the ideology that had driven his violence. The manifesto revealed Roger's extreme narcissism, his sense of entitlement to female attention and sex, his rage at rejection, and his view of the massacre as justified retribution for the suffering he believed women and society had caused him, a worldview so divorced from reality and so steeped in misogyny that it shocked even people familiar with online extremism. His manifesto and videos were analyzed by mental health professionals who identified elements of narcissistic personality disorder, possible autism spectrum disorder contributing to social difficulties, and delusional thinking, though the extent to which mental illness versus ideology drove his violence remains debated among experts. The case sparked immediate and ongoing debate about multiple social issues, including gun control, mental health intervention, misogyny and violence against women, the radicalization potential of online communities, and the responsibility of platforms that host extremist content. Gun control advocates pointed to Roger's case as evidence that California's gun laws, while relatively strict by American standards, still had gaps that allowed someone with clear warning signs to legally purchase firearms, leading to calls for more comprehensive background checks and better information sharing between mental health professionals and law enforcement. Mental health experts discussed the challenge of intervening with individuals like Roger who are clearly disturbed, but who haven't committed crimes and who may not meet the threshold for involuntary commitment, highlighting the difficulty of predicting which troubled individuals will become violent. Feminist advocates and women's rights organizations pointed to the case as an extreme example of misogynistic violence, arguing that Roger's ideology wasn't an isolated mental illness but rather an extreme version of broader cultural attitudes that objectify women and view male sexual access to women as an entitlement rather than something requiring mutual consent and attraction. The emergence of Roger as a hero figure in certain incel online communities after his death represents one of the most disturbing legacies of the case, with some individuals who identify with his grievances treating him as a martyr and even, in some cases, calling for similar violence, raising concerns about copycat attacks and the radicalization of young men in these toxic online spaces. Several subsequent attacks have been linked to incel ideology and have explicitly referenced Roger, including the Toronto van attack by Alec Manassian in 2018, demonstrating that Roger's violence and ideology continue to inspire others and pose ongoing security threats. Law enforcement and terrorism experts now recognize incel ideology as a form of extremism that can motivate violence, tracking online communities and trying to identify individuals who may be radicalizing toward violence, though the balance between monitoring potential threats and respecting free speech remains challenging. The families of Roger's victims have been vocal advocates for gun control and violence prevention, with Richard Martinez, father of Christopher Michaels Martinez, becoming a particularly prominent voice calling for legislative action to prevent similar tragedies, his grief channeled into activism aimed at changing laws and social attitudes. The case also revealed failures in intervention, as Roger had come to the attention of mental health professionals and police on multiple occasions before the massacre, including a welfare check conducted by police just weeks before the attack in response to concerns raised by his family about his disturbing YouTube videos, though officers found him polite and cooperative and didn't search his apartment where they would have found weapons and evidence of his planning. This missed intervention opportunity has been extensively analyzed in law enforcement training, with the case used to illustrate the importance of thorough threat assessment and the need for officers conducting welfare checks to be aware of warning signs beyond surface-level presentation. The Isla Vista massacre killed 6 innocent people: Chang Yuan Hong, George Chen, Wei-Han Wang, Catherine Cooper, Veronica Weiss, and Christopher Michaels Martinez, each a young person with aspirations and potential, their lives cut short by someone consumed with rage over romantic rejection. The 14 people wounded in the attack carry both physical and psychological scars, with some sustaining permanent injuries and all dealing with the trauma of surviving a mass casualty event. The broader UC Santa Barbara and Isla Vista communities were traumatized by the attack, the sense of safety in the college town shattered by an event that demonstrated vulnerability to a type of violence that had seemed remote and unlikely. Elliot Rogers' case represents a disturbing example of how stalking behavior doesn't always involve a specific identified victim but can involve a generalized fixation on a category of people, in this case, attractive young women, and how this type of fixation can lead to planned mass violence when combined with ideology that dehumanizes the objects of obsession. His extensive documentation of his thoughts and plans provides unique insight into the development of a mass shooter's mindset, showing the progression from social difficulty to rejection to bitterness to ideological extremism to violence, a pathway that researchers continue to study in hopes of identifying intervention points. The case also illustrates the danger of online echo chambers where disturbed individuals can find communities that validate and amplify their worst thoughts rather than challenging them or encouraging healthier perspectives, with incel forums serving as spaces where misogyny and violence are normalized and sometimes even celebrated. The ongoing influence of Rogers' ideology and the continued existence of online communities that celebrate his violence demonstrate that the threat he represented wasn't just about one disturbed individual, but about broader cultural and ideological currents that continue to radicalize young men toward misogynistic violence. The Isla Vista massacre stands as a tragic reminder that stalking and obsessive thinking can target categories of people rather than individuals, that rejection and loneliness can metastasize into homicidal rage when processed through ideological frameworks that blame others for personal disappointments, and that early intervention in cases of concerning behavior, while challenging and imperfect, remains crucial to preventing violence before it occurs. Number 3. Cindy Crawford, not the model, and her fatal encounter with Evelyn Reyes. The murder of Cindy Crawford in 2018 represents a chilling case of workplace stalking that escalated from unwanted romantic attention to brutal murder, demonstrating how professional environments can become hunting grounds for predators and how women trying to maintain boundaries in the workplace can find themselves targeted for violence when they reject unwanted advances. Cindy Crawford, not the famous model but a hardworking woman trying to support her family, was a 45-year-old employee at Jo-Ann Fabrics in Tomball, Texas, a Houston suburb where she worked as a department manager, known to colleagues as friendly, professional, and dedicated to both her job and her family. She had been dealing with unwanted attention from a coworker, 36-year-old Anthony Carlio, who had become obsessed with her despite her clear lack of interest and her attempts to maintain strictly professional boundaries. Carlio had been hired at Jo-Ann Fabrics in late 2017 and had quickly fixated on Cindy, pursuing her romantically despite her consistent rejections and her communications that she was not interested in any relationship with him beyond professional courtesy. According to co-workers and later investigation, Carlio's behavior had become increasingly concerning, with him making unwanted romantic overtures, following Cindy around the store, attempting to engage her in personal conversations when she made clear she wanted to keep things professional, and generally displaying the kind of persistent pursuit that crosses the line from attraction to harassment. Cindy had complained to management about Carlio's behavior, requesting that something be done to stop his unwanted attention, but the store's response was inadequate, failing to take seriously enough the potential danger that his obsessive behavior represented. She had also confided in co-workers about her concerns regarding Carlio, telling them she was uncomfortable with his attention and that he wasn't respecting her boundaries, seeking support and validation that her concerns were reasonable and that she wasn't overreacting to what some might dismiss as harmless attraction. On the morning of February 6, 2018, Cindy Crawford was working at the Jo-Ann Fabric store during regular business hours when Anthony Carlio arrived, not for his scheduled shift but specifically to confront Cindy in what would become a brutal and shocking act of workplace violence. Carlio entered the store armed with a knife, immediately seeking out Cindy, and when he located her in one of the store aisles, he attacked her with savage violence, stabbing her multiple times in front of horrified customers and co-workers who could do little to stop the assault. The attack was witnessed by multiple people, including customers who had simply come to buy fabric and craft supplies and instead found themselves present at a murder scene, traumatized by witnessing violence most people never encounter in person. Cindy Crawford fought for her life, displaying tremendous courage and will to survive, but the severity of her injuries was such that she couldn't overcome the damage inflicted by Carlio's attack. She was rushed to a local hospital where medical teams worked desperately to save her life, but her injuries were too severe, and she died from the stabbing wounds shortly after arriving at the hospital. Meanwhile, after stabbing Cindy, Anthony Carlio fled the Jo-Ann Fabric store, leaving behind a crime scene of horror and confusion, with blood evidence, traumatized witnesses, and the beginning of a manhunt for a killer who was now on the run. Law enforcement responded rapidly, with multiple agencies coordinating to locate Carlio before he could harm anyone else or escape the area entirely, recognizing that he had just committed murder and remained armed and dangerous. The manhunt for Carlio lasted several hours, with police issuing alerts and searching the area around the store and potential locations where he might flee, understanding that every moment he remained at large represented potential danger to the public. Carlio was eventually located at a hotel in the Houston area where he had barricaded himself, apparently contemplating his next move or possibly planning suicide, though he ultimately surrendered to police after negotiations, ending the standoff peacefully from law enforcement's perspective, though far too late for Cindy Crawford. After his arrest, Carlio was charged with murder in the death of Cindy Crawford, facing a legal process that would examine not only the act of violence itself but the stalking and harassment that had preceded it and the failures of the workplace to adequately protect Cindy from a threat that multiple people had recognized. The investigation revealed that Carlio had purchased the knife specifically for the attack, demonstrating premeditation and planning rather than a spontaneous act of passion, evidence that would prove crucial in establishing the first-degree nature of the murder. Detectives also uncovered evidence of Carlio's obsession with Cindy, including his persistent attempts to contact her, his inability to accept her rejections, and his escalating anger as it became clear that she would never reciprocate his interest, a pattern typical of violence motivated by rejected romantic or sexual interest. The case against Anthony Carlio was strong, built on eyewitness testimony from people who saw him commit the murder, physical evidence including the weapon and blood evidence, and his own actions before and after the killing that demonstrated consciousness of guilt. During legal proceedings, Carlio's mental state became a topic of examination, with defense attorneys suggesting that mental illness may have played a role in his actions, but prosecutors argued that regardless of any mental health issues, he had clearly planned the attack and knew what he was doing, evidenced by his purchase of the weapon and his specific targeting of Cindy. The trial highlighted the inadequacy of Joe Fabric's response to Cindy's complaints about Carlio's behavior, raising questions about corporate responsibility for employee safety and whether the company had taken sufficient steps to protect Cindy from a coworker whose behavior had been reported as concerning. Workplace violence experts testified about warning signs that had been present in Carlio's behavior and about best practices for addressing employee complaints about harassment and unwanted attention. Testimony that implicitly criticized the company's handling of Cindy's reports. Cindy's family attended the trial, seeking justice for a woman who had simply gone to work and paid for that ordinary act with her life, mourning a mother, daughter, sister, and friend whose murder in a craft store during daylight hours seemed almost incomprehensibly senseless. In December 2020, Anthony Carlio was found guilty of murder in the death of Cindy Crawford, with the jury rejecting arguments about mental illness as a complete defense and accepting that he had knowingly and intentionally killed her because she had rejected his romantic interest. Carlio was sentenced to life in prison, ensuring that he would never be free again and providing Cindy's family with at least the cold comfort that her killer would be punished for his crime. The murder of Cindy Crawford sparked conversations about workplace stalking, the responsibility of employers to protect employees from coworkers who display threatening behavior, and the danger women face when they reject unwanted romantic or sexual attention from men who feel entitled to their interest. Employment law experts discussed the case as an example of why companies need robust policies for addressing workplace harassment, why complaints must be taken seriously and investigated thoroughly, and why, in some cases, separation of employees or termination may be necessary to protect potential victims from escalating behavior. The fact that Cindy had reported Carlio's behavior and that the company's response had been insufficient made this case not just a murder but a preventable tragedy, raising questions about civil liability and whether better intervention could have saved Cindy's life. Workplace violence prevention specialists used the case in training, illustrating the warning signs that preceded the murder: unwanted romantic pursuit, inability to accept rejection, persistent contact despite boundaries being set, escalating behavior, and emphasizing that these signs should trigger serious intervention rather than being dismissed as harmless crush or mere annoyance. The setting of the murder, in a craft store during business hours with customers present, challenged assumptions some people held about where violence occurs, demonstrating that workplace violence can happen anywhere, not just in traditionally dangerous occupations or rough neighborhoods. The trauma experienced by witnesses to the attack, employees and customers who saw Cindy being stabbed, highlighted the ripple effects of workplace violence, with people who happened to be present that day dealing with PTSD and psychological impacts from witnessing such horrific violence. Joe Fabrics faced scrutiny and criticism for how they had handled Cindy's complaints, and while the company expressed condolences to her family, questions remained about whether they had done enough to protect their employee and whether policy changes would be implemented to prevent similar tragedies. Cindy Crawford's murder illustrates the particular vulnerability of women in workplaces where they may be required to interact professionally with men who develop romantic or sexual interest in them, creating situations where maintaining professional boundaries can be interpreted as rejection and can trigger retaliatory violence from men who feel entitled to female attention and unable to accept refusal. The case also demonstrates that stalking in workplace contexts can be just as dangerous as other forms of stalking, with the added complication that victims can't easily avoid their stalkers when both work in the same location and may be required by their jobs to interact. Cindy's attempts to handle the situation appropriately, reporting the behavior to management, confiding in coworkers, maintaining professional boundaries, were exactly what experts recommend. Yet these steps weren't sufficient to prevent the violence, illustrating the difficult reality that even when victims do everything right, they may still be harmed by determined perpetrators. The inadequacy of the store's response to her complaints raises the crucial point that victim action alone isn't enough. Institutions must take threats seriously, investigate thoroughly, and be willing to take strong action, including separating employees or terminating employment when someone's behavior creates a danger to others. Anthony Carlio's conviction and life sentence brought legal accountability for Cindy Crawford's murder, but it couldn't restore her life or heal the trauma experienced by her family, co-workers, and the witnesses to her death. The case remains a stark reminder that workplace stalking is a serious threat that requires serious institutional response, that rejection of romantic interest can trigger violence in individuals unable to accept that their feelings aren't reciprocated, and that women trying to navigate professional environments while maintaining boundaries against unwanted attention are sometimes placed in impossible situations where any response, acceptance or rejection, carries potential danger. Cindy Crawford went to work on February 6, 2018, expecting an ordinary day at a job she had held for years, and instead encountered a man so consumed by his obsession and so enraged by her rejection that he murdered her in a public place during daylight hours, her death serving as a tragic example of how stalking in professional contexts can escalate to lethal violence, and how important it is for employers to take seriously their responsibility to protect workers from coworkers who pose threats. Number 2. Jasmine Fiore and Ryan Jenkins. Murder after reality TV. The case of Jasmine Fiore and Ryan Jenkins represents a horrifying example of how quickly romantic relationships can turn deadly when they involve domestic violence and obsessive control. A case that gained international attention due to the reality television connection and the brutal nature of the murder, and that ended with a manhunt spanning 2 countries before the killer's suicide denied justice its day in court. Jasmine Fiore was a beautiful 28-year-old model and aspiring actress who had worked in swimsuit modeling, promotional events, and various entertainment industry jobs, living in Los Angeles and pursuing the kind of career many attractive young women aspire to in Southern California. Ryan Alexander Jenkins was a 32-year-old reality television contestant who had appeared on VH1's Megan Wants a Millionaire, a dating show where contestants competed for the attention of a woman seeking a wealthy partner, and who claimed to be a successful real estate developer, though his actual financial situation and background contained significant misrepresentations. Jenkins and Fiore met in Las Vegas in early 2009 and began a whirlwind romance that included an impulsive wedding in March 2009, just weeks after they had met, the kind of rushed relationship that often indicates poor judgment and lack of understanding of one's partner rather than true love and compatibility. From the beginning, their relationship was volatile and marked by arguments, jealousy, and control issues, with people close to Jasmine noticing that Ryan displayed possessive behavior and that she seemed unhappy and stressed when discussing him. By May 2009, just 2 months after their Las Vegas wedding, Jasmine had filed for annulment, recognizing that marrying Ryan had been a mistake and seeking to extricate herself from the marriage before it progressed further, though Ryan contested the annulment and the legal process was ongoing at the time of her murder. Despite the annulment filing and Jasmine's clear desire to end the marriage, Ryan Jenkins continued pursuing contact with her, displaying the kind of inability to accept rejection that characterizes many domestic violence and stalking cases, refusing to acknowledge that the relationship was over despite Jasmine's legal actions demonstrating her intent to end it. In August 2009, despite the pending annulment and the troubled history of their brief relationship, Jasmine and Ryan spent time together in San Diego, attending a poker tournament and apparently attempting some form of reconciliation or at least maintaining contact, decisions that would prove fatal for Jasmine and that illustrate how difficult it can be for domestic violence victims to completely sever ties with their abusers, even when they intellectually understand the danger. On the evening of August 14, 2009, Jasmine and Ryan were seen together at a poker event in San Diego, with witnesses later recounting that they appeared to be arguing and that the tension between them was visible even in public, signs that the relationship remained troubled and volatile. What happened later that night and into the early morning of August 15th would be reconstructed through forensic evidence, witness statements, and the crime scene, painting a picture of a murder motivated by rage, jealousy, and the perpetrator's inability to accept the end of a relationship. Ryan Jenkins murdered Jasmine Fiore in a brutal attack that involved strangulation and beating, killing her in what investigators believe was their hotel room or another private location in the Buena Park area of Orange County, California. After murdering Jasmine, Jenkins engaged in actions clearly designed to conceal the crime and prevent or delay identification of the victim, behavior that demonstrated consciousness of guilt and premeditation in the cover-up, even if the murder itself may have occurred during a rage-fueled argument. He removed Jasmine's teeth and fingers, mutilating her body in an attempt to prevent identification through dental records or fingerprints, a level of post-mortem mutilation that is relatively rare and that indicates significant planning or presence of mind even in the immediate aftermath of murder. Jenkins then stuffed Jasmine's mutilated body into a suitcase, a horrifying detail that would later become one of the most shocking aspects of the case when it was reported in media coverage. He disposed of the suitcase containing Jasmine's body in a dumpster in Buena Park, California, treating her remains as garbage and apparently hoping that the body would be taken to a landfill where it might never be discovered or, if discovered, might be too degraded to identify. On August 15, 2009, a person going through the dumpster discovered the suitcase and, upon opening it, found Jasmine Fiore body, immediately contacting police and triggering a homicide investigation that would quickly focus on Ryan Jenkins as the primary suspect. The condition of the body, with teeth and fingers removed, initially complicated identification, but investigators were able to identify Jasmine through serial numbers on her breast implants, a medical device identifier that Jenkins apparently hadn't known about or considered when he attempted to prevent identification. As soon as Jasmine was identified and investigators learned about her recent contact with Ryan Jenkins and their troubled relationship history, he became the primary and then the sole suspect in her murder. However, Ryan Jenkins had already fled, leaving the area shortly after disposing of Jasmine's body and heading north toward the Canadian border, beginning a multi-day manhunt that would involve law enforcement agencies in multiple jurisdictions and 2 countries. Jenkins drove from Southern California to Washington State, crossing into Canada at the Blaine, Washington crossing on August 17, 2009, just days after murdering Jasmine and before police had publicly identified him as a suspect, giving him a crucial head start in his attempt to escape justice. Canadian authorities were alerted that Jenkins was a murder suspect who had entered their country, triggering an international manhunt and making Jenkins one of the most wanted fugitives in North America as media coverage of the case intensified. The search for Jenkins involved the FBI, U.S. Marshals, Canadian police agencies, and multiple local law enforcement jurisdictions, with authorities warning that he should be considered dangerous and advising the public to report any sightings rather than approach him. Media coverage of the case was intense, with Jasmine Fiore murder dominating news cycles due to her beauty, Jenkins' reality TV appearance, the brutal nature of the crime, and the ongoing manhunt for the suspect, creating a story that combined elements of celebrity culture, true crime, and international fugitive pursuit. VH1 immediately canceled Megan Wants a Millionaire and pulled all episodes from rotation, not wanting to profit from a show featuring someone accused of murder and facing criticism for not having more thoroughly vetted contestants' backgrounds, particularly given that Jenkins had a prior domestic violence conviction from an incident with a previous girlfriend that should have raised red flags about his capacity for violence toward women. The manhunt ended on August 23, 2009, when Ryan Jenkins was found dead in a motel room in Hope, British Columbia, having committed suicide by hanging, ending his life and any possibility of justice being served through a criminal trial. His suicide was discovered by motel staff who entered his room and found his body, with Canadian authorities confirming his identity and notifying U.S. law enforcement that the fugitive they had been seeking was dead. Jenkins' suicide meant that the case would never go to trial, that his guilt would never be legally proven through the criminal justice process, and that Jasmine's family would never have the opportunity to confront him in court or hear a judge pronounce sentence for his crime. However, the evidence against Jenkins was overwhelming, and both law enforcement and the public had little doubt about his guilt given the forensic evidence, witness statements placing them together shortly before the murder, his flight from justice, and the clear motive of rage over Jasmine's desire to end their relationship. The investigation into Jasmine Fiore murder revealed additional disturbing details about Ryan Jenkins and his history, including that he had been charged with domestic violence in 2007 for an assault on a different girlfriend, a case that should have served as a warning sign about his potential for violence, but that didn't prevent him from appearing on reality television or from Jasmine entering into a relationship with him. Friends and family of Jasmine spoke publicly about their grief and about warning signs they had noticed about Ryan's controlling and possessive behavior, with some expressing regret that they hadn't pushed harder to help Jasmine see the danger or to extricate herself completely from the relationship. The case sparked criticism of reality television production companies and their background check processes, with questions raised about whether VH1 and Mindless Entertainment, the production company behind Megan Wants a Millionaire, had adequately investigated contestants' backgrounds and whether Jenkins' prior domestic violence charge should have disqualified him from participation. Reality television industry observers discussed the case as evidence that entertainment companies needed more rigorous vetting of participants, particularly for dating shows where personal history of violence could pose real risks not just to other contestants, but to people they might meet and date as a result of appearing on television. The brutal mutilation of Jasmine's body, the removal of her teeth and fingers, represented an attempt to prevent identification that fortunately failed due to medical device serial numbers, but that demonstrated Jenkins' cold calculation even in the aftermath of murder, showing that he was capable of significant postmortem planning to avoid consequences for his crime. Jasmine Fiore murder at age 28 cut short a life full of potential, robbing her family of a daughter and sister they loved and leaving friends mourning someone they described as kind, beautiful, and full of life, all lost to a man who couldn't accept that she wanted to end their relationship. The case illustrates how domestic violence can escalate rapidly to homicide, how attempts to leave an abusive relationship represent the most dangerous time for victims, and how prior violence should be taken as a serious warning sign of future danger rather than being minimized or overlooked. Jenkins' prior domestic violence conviction, his controlling behavior toward Jasmine, and the volatile nature of their relationship were all red flags that, in hindsight, clearly indicated the potential for lethal violence, though predicting which abusive relationships will escalate to murder remains challenging even for experts. The international aspect of the case, Jenkins fleeing to Canada and the subsequent cross-border manhunt, highlighted issues of fugitive pursuit and international cooperation in criminal justice, with the case being cited in discussions about extradition treaties and law enforcement coordination. Ryan Jenkins' suicide in a Canadian motel room ended his life but couldn't restore Jasmine Fiore or provide her family with the trial and conviction they deserved, leaving them with grief compounded by the lack of legal accountability and closure. The case remains frequently discussed in true crime communities and in analyses of reality television culture, serving as a cautionary tale about whirlwind romances, the danger of ignoring red flags in relationships, the importance of background checks for people entering public life, and the tragic consequences when violence toward women is not taken seriously until it's too late. Jasmine Fiore murder and the circumstances surrounding it demonstrate how stalking and domestic violence in intimate relationships can quickly turn lethal, how past violence is the best predictor of future violence, and how important it is for women trying to leave dangerous relationships to have support, safety planning, and sometimes law enforcement intervention to protect them during the most dangerous transition period when their abuser realizes he is losing control. The reality television connection and the gruesome details of the crime ensured that Jasmine's case received extensive media coverage, but underneath the sensational elements was a tragedy that plays out with disturbing frequency across the country. A woman killed by a current or former intimate partner who couldn't accept the end of a relationship and who chose violence as his final assertion of control. Number 1. Morgan Harrington and her unsolved abduction. The Metallica concert tragedy. The disappearance and murder of Morgan Dana Harrington represents one of the most haunting and heartbreaking cases of stranger abduction and murder in recent American history, a case that began with a young woman attending a concert with friends and ended with her death at the hands of a serial predator, a tragedy that remained unsolved for years before advances in DNA technology finally connected her murder to another horrifying crime and identified a killer who had evaded justice for far too long. Morgan Harrington was a beautiful and vivacious 20-year-old Virginia Tech student, described by everyone who knew her as bright, artistic, kind, and full of life, studying education with plans to become a teacher and making the most of her college years with the kind of enthusiasm and optimism that characterizes young people who believe the world is full of possibilities. On the evening of October 17, 2009, Morgan attended a Metallica concert at the John Paul Jones Arena in Charlottesville, Virginia, with several friends, anticipating a fun night of music and socializing, the kind of normal college experience that thousands of students engage in every weekend across the country without incident. During the concert at approximately 8:30 p.m., Morgan left her seat and exited the arena, telling friends she needed to use the restroom or get some air. Accounts vary on the exact reason she gave, but in any case, it was presented as a temporary departure from which she intended to return. However, the John Paul Jones Arena has a strict no re-entry policy, meaning that once Morgan stepped outside, she would not be allowed back into the concert, a policy she apparently wasn't aware of or didn't consider when she made the decision to exit the building. When security personnel refused to let Morgan re-enter the arena, she found herself outside the venue while her friends were inside enjoying the concert. Unable to rejoin them due to the venue's inflexible policy, and apparently unable or unwilling to contact them effectively to figure out alternative plans. Over the next several hours, Morgan was seen by various witnesses in the area around the arena, with some people reporting seeing her walking in the parking lots, others seeing her on the nearby Copley Road Bridge, and several witnessing her appearing distressed, injured, or in need of help, though the exact sequence of events and Morgan's state of mind during this time remains somewhat unclear and has been the subject of extensive investigation and speculation. Some witnesses reported that Morgan seemed intoxicated or impaired, stumbling or acting confused, while others suggested she appeared injured, possibly from a fall, with accounts of a cut or injury to her face. Several witnesses reported seeing Morgan trying to hitchhike or flag down cars, attempting to get a ride from the area, behavior that was unusual for a young woman who had come to the concert with friends and who had a phone she could have used to call for help. At some point during the evening, Morgan apparently encountered someone who she either voluntarily got into a vehicle with or who abducted her by force, though exactly how this encounter occurred and whether Morgan was incapacitated, coerced, or deceived into getting into the vehicle remains unknown. What is certain is that after being seen outside the arena by multiple witnesses, Morgan Harrington vanished, last seen in the Charlottesville area on the evening of October 17th, and not heard from again despite having a cell phone and despite the reasonable expectation that she would have contacted friends or family once she realized she couldn't get back into the concert. Morgan's friends, realizing she wasn't answering her phone and hadn't rejoined them after the concert ended, became concerned and tried to locate her, eventually contacting her parents when they couldn't find her, triggering a missing person investigation that would quickly become a suspected abduction case. Morgan's parents, Gil and Dan Harrington, immediately recognized that something was terribly wrong when they learned Morgan was missing, knowing that it was completely out of character for her to disappear without contacting anyone or to cause such concern, and they rushed to Charlottesville to aid in the search for their daughter. Law enforcement took the case seriously from the beginning, conducting extensive searches of the area around the arena, interviewing witnesses who had seen Morgan outside the venue, and trying to piece together her movements and what had happened to her after she was last seen. In the days following Morgan's disappearance, some of her personal items were found in locations away from the arena, including her purse and cell phone, discoveries that suggested she had been in areas beyond the immediate vicinity of the concert venue, but that didn't provide clear answers about what had happened to her or where she was now. The case received extensive media coverage, particularly in Virginia and regionally, with Morgan's photograph appearing in newspapers, on television news broadcasts, and in missing person alerts, her distinctive appearance and the unusual circumstances of her disappearance capturing public attention and generating numerous tips that investigators had to follow up on and evaluate. The search for Morgan continued through fall 2009 and into winter, with volunteers joining law enforcement in searching fields, wooded areas, and other locations where she might be found, while her parents maintained a constant media presence, appealing for information and keeping their daughter's case in the public eye. The uncertainty and not knowing what had happened to Morgan was agonizing for her family and friends, who held on to hope that she might still be alive while also having to confront the increasingly grim reality that as time passed without contact, the likelihood of a positive outcome decreased. On January 26, 2010, more than 3 months after Morgan's disappearance, her skeletal remains were discovered by a farmer on his property in the Anchorage Farm area of Albemarle County, Virginia, about 10 miles from where she was last seen in Charlottesville, bringing the devastating confirmation that Morgan was dead and had been for some time. The location where her remains were found was remote, in a field that wouldn't typically see foot traffic, suggesting that her body had been deliberately placed there by someone who knew the area and who had chosen a location where discovery might be delayed or might never occur. The condition of the remains, having been exposed to the elements for months, limited what forensic examination could determine about the exact manner and cause of Morgan's death, though investigators concluded that her death was a homicide based on the circumstances and the location where her body was found. The investigation into Morgan's murder immediately focused on developing DNA evidence and identifying suspects, with forensic teams collecting any available biological evidence from Morgan's remains and clothing that might identify her killer. The DNA evidence recovered from Morgan's body was entered into databases and compared against known samples, and in a breakthrough that would eventually lead to identifying her killer, the DNA matched evidence from an unsolved sexual assault case from 2005 in Fairfax, Virginia, connecting Morgan's murder to another horrific crime and indicating that her killer was a serial offender who had attacked women on multiple occasions. The 2005 Fairfax case involved a young woman who had been sexually assaulted in her apartment by an unknown intruder, an attack she survived and reported to police, providing a description and, crucially, forensic evidence including DNA, though the perpetrator had never been identified or apprehended at that time. The DNA link between the Fairfax assault and Morgan's murder indicated that the same individual was responsible for both crimes, suggesting a serial predator who had attacked women in different jurisdictions and who had evaded capture for years, making him all the more dangerous and making Morgan's case all the more urgent to solve. For several years following the discovery of Morgan's remains and the DNA connection to the Fairfax case, investigators worked to identify the perpetrator, pursuing leads, interviewing potential suspects, and hoping for a break in the case that would finally give Morgan's family answers and bring her killer to justice. That break came in 2014 when DNA evidence connected the same perpetrator to an additional case, the abduction, sexual assault, and murder of Hannah Graham, an 18-year-old University of Virginia student who disappeared from Charlottesville in September 2014 and whose body was found weeks later in a rural area of Albemarle County. Hannah Graham's disappearance had been captured on surveillance video that showed her in downtown Charlottesville with a man later identified as Jesse Leroy Matthew Jr., a 32-year-old local resident and hospital worker who had been seen with Hannah shortly before she vanished, providing investigators with a suspect whose DNA would prove crucial to solving multiple cases. When Jesse Matthew was arrested in connection with Hannah Graham's disappearance and murder, his DNA was collected and tested, revealing that he was the source of the DNA evidence from both the 2005 Fairfax assault and Morgan Harrington's murder, finally identifying the serial predator who had terrorized women in Virginia for at least a decade and providing answers that Morgan's family had been desperately seeking for nearly 5 years. Jesse Matthews' arrest and the DNA evidence connecting him to Morgan's murder brought both relief that her killer had been identified and anguish that it had taken another young woman's death to finally catch him, raising questions about whether Morgan's case might have been solved sooner and whether Hannah Graham's murder might have been prevented if different investigative strategies had been employed or if different circumstances had led to Matthew's identification earlier. The investigation into Jesse Matthew revealed that he had a history of sexual assault allegations dating back to his college years, with accusations from multiple women that had never resulted in convictions, allowing him to continue working in positions of trust and to continue victimizing women without facing consequences for his earlier alleged crimes. This history highlighted systemic failures in how sexual assault allegations are investigated and prosecuted, and how predators can continue offending when they aren't held accountable for earlier crimes, a pattern that unfortunately repeats itself in cases across the country. Jesse Matthew was charged with first-degree murder in Morgan Harrington's death, as well as capital murder and abduction with intent to defile in Hannah Graham's case, facing multiple life sentences and potentially the death penalty if convicted of capital murder. The evidence against Matthew was overwhelming, including the DNA evidence definitively placing him at both crime scenes, surveillance video showing him with Hannah Graham before her disappearance, and other forensic and circumstantial evidence connecting him to both murders. Rather than face trial, Jesse Matthew pleaded guilty in 2016 to murdering both Morgan Harrington and Hannah Graham, accepting responsibility for both crimes in a plea deal that resulted in 4 consecutive life sentences, ensuring that he would never be free again and sparing the victims' families the trauma of enduring trials. Matthew also pleaded guilty in the 2005 Fairfax sexual assault case, the attack that had first put his DNA into the system and that had ultimately led to connecting him to Morgan's murder, resulting in additional prison time, though the life sentences for murder already ensured he would die in prison. During the plea proceedings and sentencing, Gil and Dan Harrington, Morgan's parents, made victim impact statements describing the devastation of losing their daughter, the agony of not knowing what had happened to her for months, and their relief that her killer had finally been identified and would face justice, though they emphasized that no sentence could truly balance the scales or restore what had been taken from them. The Harringtons have become advocates for victims' rights and for improved investigation of violent crimes, particularly sexual assaults, arguing that if Jesse Matthew had been held accountable for earlier alleged assaults, Morgan and Hannah might still be alive, using their grief to push for systemic changes that might prevent future tragedies. They established the Morgan Harrington Educational Wing at their local hospital and have worked with legislation aimed at improving evidence collection and testing in sexual assault cases, determined that some good should come from their daughter's death. The case of Morgan Harrington highlights several critical issues in modern crime investigation and prevention, including the importance of DNA evidence collection and testing, the value of DNA databases in connecting crimes across jurisdictions, the danger posed by serial offenders, and the critical importance of taking sexual assault allegations seriously and investigating them thoroughly before offenders escalate to murder. The fact that Morgan's murder remained unsolved for nearly 5 years, and was only solved when her killer murdered another young woman, represents both a failure of the investigative system and a demonstration of how difficult it can be to identify offenders when physical evidence is limited, and when the perpetrator has no direct connection to the victim that would place him on an initial suspect list. Morgan's case also illustrates the vulnerability of young people in social situations, particularly when separated from friends, when impaired by alcohol or other substances, and when making decisions about accepting rides from strangers or acquaintances, though it's crucial to note that the responsibility for her death rests entirely with Jesse Matthew and not with any decisions Morgan made that night. The no re-entry policy at the John Paul Jones Arena has been criticized in the context of Morgan's case, with some arguing that if she had been allowed to rejoin her friends inside the concert, she might never have encountered Jesse Matthew and might still be alive, though venue policies are complicated by security concerns and aren't easily changed. The extensive media coverage of Morgan's disappearance and the subsequent investigation demonstrates the power of public attention in keeping cases active and generating tips, though it also highlights disparities in which cases receive media attention, with young, white, attractive women like Morgan and Hannah receiving extensive coverage while cases involving minority victims, or those from less privileged backgrounds often receive far less attention. Morgan Dana Harrington's life was cut short at age 20, her potential unfulfilled, her plans to become a teacher never realized, her family forever incomplete, all because she encountered a serial predator on a night that should have been nothing more than a fun concert with friends. Her case serves as a tragic reminder that monsters walk among us, that predators can appear normal and even hold positions of trust while hiding their true natures, that the criminal justice system's failure to hold offenders accountable for early crimes can lead to escalation and additional victims, and that solving cases sometimes requires time, technology, and unfortunately sometimes additional crimes before enough evidence accumulates to identify and apprehend the perpetrator. Jesse Matthew is now serving multiple life sentences in a Virginia prison, where he will remain until his death, unable to harm anyone else but also a constant reminder that his crimes might have been prevented if earlier allegations had been pursued more aggressively or if different circumstances had placed him on investigators' radar before he had the opportunity to kill. Morgan's parents continue to honor her memory through advocacy and charitable work, ensuring that her death is not forgotten and that her case contributes to preventing future tragedies through improved investigation techniques, better DNA evidence handling, and greater societal commitment to holding sexual offenders accountable before they escalate to murder.